Hello and welcome to another episode of the Strength Syndicate podcast with myself, Shane Storey, and my co-host, Lawrence King. How are you, Lawrence?
All right, man. How are you?
I'm good. I'm looking forward to having a bit of a chin wag on today's topic. It's going to be
Perfect.
pretty relevant for us now as we come into the competition, making sure we catch all the Z's. So I suppose, yeah, if you didn't kind of catch on from that, we're going to be talking about sleep. So sleep obviously is it's quite an important thing that maybe people don't put as much emphasis on as they should. It's such a low hanging fruit. Like, geez, if you're going to be thinking of kind of getting into something like vitamin S, I suppose vitamin S is probably going to be sleep more so than steroids. It's probably the most kind of potent thing you can do every day that is going to allow you to improve your performance, improve your body composition, improve your health. So it's definitely something to pay a bit more attention on. And we are going to talk today about like what is sleep in general, like why do we need sleep, its effects on performance, and then just getting some practical recommendations as to things that you can do that will improve your sleep. So, Lawrence, you are uh, pretty into sleep.
Yeah.
Where do we start?
Um,
What is it?
I suppose we'll break it down into maybe like sleep, the structure of your sleep, what happens when you sleep, and then I suppose maybe why we sleep. As regard like for people, we spend about a third of our whole lives asleep. So roughly, if you take a 24-hour day, we're awake for 16 hours, and you sleep for roughly 8. Stratify that across your lifetime, and you're asleep for about a third of your life. As you're younger, obviously as a baby, you sleep the most, but your sleep recommendations as you age don't really change or decrease. So as a baby, you might sleep from anywhere from 12 to 16 hours a day. When you become a teenager and you're going through lots and lots of changes, you still probably need anywhere from 9 to 11 hours of sleep. And as an adult, a fully formed adult at least, um, you're talking maybe a minimum of 8 hours of sleep. And for different reasons, as we get older, that feeling of sleep or feeling of need for sleep changes. Um, but we all need sleep, and the absence or lack of sleep or lack of enough sleep has, as you said, fairly disastrous consequences. Um, so the first thing I suppose to talk about would be like, as I was saying earlier, like sleepfulness and wakefulness. I suppose for sleepfulness, there's a constant homeostatic pressure for sleep going on from the moment you wake. So we'll call that sleep pressure. So from when you wake, you're starting at a baseline level, and that accumulates across the day. This sleep pressure accumulates across the day, peaks just before bed at night, and it dissipates throughout the night. Um, and that wakefulness um, is regulated by your circadian rhythm, and that builds across the day again, counteracts the sleep pressure, and promotes your wakefulness and alertness that you feel during the day. So wakefulness and alertness kind of peaks typically around mid-morning, early afternoon. Sleep pressure starts to rise. So think of it like a graph. Your sleep pressure is at its lowest in the morning. Your circadian rhythm brings you towards this really wakeful point in your day. That peaks, starts to decline, and then your sleep pressure starts to rise thereafter. Um, and then I suppose in that sleep consolidation um, towards the end of the night, or sorry, as that wake promoting system begins to decline at bedtime, that allows for sleep consolidation as the need for sleep dissipates across the night. So obviously, as the sleep pressure decreases throughout the night, um, your wakefulness starts to slowly rise again in the morning. Think of it like a slow rising arch, as opposed to something which is just on or off. These are just what am I trying to say? They're kind of acting in tandem almost, as in two different kind of worlds. So then with an appropriate night's sleep, the drive for sleep is reduced, so that sleep pressure is reduced. The circadian waking drive begins to increase and the cycle starts over. So your total sleep time remains the same, but it's randomly distributed over the day and night. So it's how your circadian rhythm would synchronize with the sleep pressure is fairly dependent on how much sleep you've gotten the night before. And they're not just happening in random, they are happening kind of in tandem. Does that kind of make sense? So that sleep pressure and circadian rhythm are interacting throughout the day, depending on how much, not depending, but for it to work properly, it's depending on you getting the right amount of sleep.
Yeah, because sleep essentially is acting as something to clear the body of this like sleep pressure that builds up over the day. Like you may have heard of the sleep pressure being called adenosine, and something like caffeine essentially works as an antagonist to this adenosine. It blocks it. So that's why if you drink coffee, you drink caffeine, you essentially get this adenosine or sleep pressure being held off.
It's that, yeah, they bind to the same receptor, caffeine, adenosine, adenosine. And like you said, like it's not really if you take too much caffeine, it's that, well, I suppose it is and it isn't. It's just like the half-life of caffeine is quite long. So that's why typically the cutoff point for caffeine would be about 3 o'clock. So if you take 400 milligrams of caffeine at 3 o'clock, about 6 or 7 hours later, you have half that amount still active in your system. So 200 milligrams of caffeine still active in your system at 9 p.m. is 9 or 10 p.m. Not the best for sleep. But that circadian rhythm I was talking about controls the sleep-wake cycle. So controls when you feel sleepy, when you feel most awake. And it kind of modulates tons of other stuff as well. Like when you're most active during the day, your eating, your body temperature, hormone secretion, muscle strength, all this kind of stuff. As regards kind of muscle strength and the circadian rhythm, we kind of know that you're strongest in the evening, as opposed to during the day. There's a couple of reasons hypothesized for that, but it's weird that it's not exactly at the point you typically expect people to be most awake. But we all have this kind of internal body clock that we call the circadian rhythm. Plants tend to have it, people have it, and it tends to be very closely related to light. And obviously we sense light through our eyes. This gets fed through to our brain, and in our brain we've the super chiasmatic nucleus, CSN, that regulates all that. But I suppose for sleep, it's very easy to just break it down into just 4 stages, typically. And they're all kind of on a continuum of depth, really. You've kind of gone from light sleep to heavier sleep. But really the main 2 ways, or not 2 ways, but the binary of sleep is non-REM sleep, so non-rapid eye movement, and in REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep. And really it's not fully kind of understood it's not really kind of fully understood what functions these 2 different, or not what functions, we know what functions they have, but we don't really understand why. So we'll start off with stage 1. So we're not going to kind of bog people down too much at this, because like the more and more you read into it, the more and more you realize sleep is an absolute rabbit hole to read into. But non-REM sleep, it's kind of a transitional role in the sleep stage cycle. So besides for newborns and people with any kind of neurological disorder like narcolepsy, usually your sleep cycle will start with this non-REM stage 1. And it usually lasts like the first 5 minutes of a sleep cycle. So our sleep cycles typically last like 90 to about 90 minutes, 75 to 90 minutes. I could be after making a hames of that. I think that's roughly the time.
Yeah, no, that's correct.
And it's usually about like 2 or 5% of the total amount of sleep you'll actually get. And that's why, like, as soon as you fall asleep, if you hear like a loud noise or anything like that, it's pretty easy to disrupt. It's quite a light stage of sleep. So then, like, if we're talking about brain activity, you will hear, if you read into sleep, you'll hear a lot about brain activity. So you'll hear about like alpha waves and beta waves. Really, all you need to know is that with these different types of brain waves, alpha waves are the waves you typically see when you're awake, and beta waves are the waves you typically see when you're asleep. Alpha waves, more brain activity; beta waves, less brain activity. And that's measured through, and I'm going to make fucking balls of this, electroencephalographic. Electroencephalographic. That sounds about right.
Yeah.
Electroencephalographic. Yeah. But a brain activity on that EEG in stage 1, where you're transitioning from wakefulness to non-wakefulness. So like where you've got, like, I suppose you can call it loss of consciousness if you want. Shows like a really mixed frequency. So like you have like those alpha and beta brainwaves kind of going a little bit haywire. And they kind of, you're talking 8 to like 13 seconds of patterns. So they're, I don't know anything about brainwaves, but we're looking at them in comparison to, let's say, like when we get to REM sleep, you see a lot more kind of chaotic brain energy, brain waves than you would kind of in stages 2, 3, and 4. So then we're talking about stage 2. So it lasts about like 10 to 25 minutes in the initial cycle, and it lengthens with each successive cycle. So obviously over the night, you're going to have your first sleep cycle, then you have another sleep cycle, then you might have another and another and another. So it's not that once you fall asleep, you're going from, okay, we're in stage 1 for 15 minutes, then we're in stage 2 for 3 hours, then we're in stage 3 for 2 hours. It's that these cycles are constantly repeating themselves, more or less. So you could have watching overnight, maybe like 8, 9 sleep cycles, maybe.
I think it's like 5 to 6, because if we look at a sleep cycle lasting about 90 minutes, on average about 90 minutes, and that's probably gonna, if you're sleeping for 8 hours, it's probably gonna be about 4 to 5 sleep cycles.
Yeah.
Or 4 to 6, really depends how long you're gonna be sleeping for as well.
Yeah. So it's really dependent on how long you're sleeping and the quality of your sleep. If you're waking a bunch during the night, you mightn't get very much REM sleep at all. If you're really wakeful, just dependent on the individual. But then with stage 2, it lasts about between 15 and 25 minutes in the initial sleep cycle, and it lengthens with each successive cycle. So you're talking maybe between 45 to 55% of the total sleep episode could be spent in stage 2. And an individual in stage 2 requires a lot more noise or kind of stimulus to awaken them from sleep than if you were in stage 1. And brain activity on that EEG we were talking about, electroencephalographic, I don't know what the fuck you want to call it, EEG, we're keeping it EEG anyway.
EEG, yeah.
Shows pretty low voltage and frequency in that brain activity. So we're seeing decreased brain activity. And those sleep spindles that we'll chat about in a small bit are really important for memory. So that memory consolidation from the day, go back and kind of cement the memory or that learning that took place during the day. So people that learn a new task during the day, or they learn a new skill, have a much higher density of sleep spindles than those that don't have any learning or anything going on during the day. So stage 3 and stage 4. So now we're into kind of the really low brain activity stages of sleep. And most of this occurs during the first third of the night, and kind of between stage 3 and 4, there are kind of like discernible characteristics. Again, it's kind of outside of the remit of this, I suppose, but it is kind of interesting to read into. So stage 3 kind of lasts only a couple of minutes, and it's about between 3 and 8% of the total sleep, again, dependent on the individual. And then the last kind of stage is stage 4. So that's the last non-REM part of sleep, and that lasts about 20 to 40 minutes of the sleep cycle. And it makes up about 10 or 15% of your sleep. So then in that part of the sleep, your arousal threshold is the highest. So you are gone. You are sound asleep at that stage. Very little is waking you up. And we tend to see, kind of in terms of brainwave activity, we tend to see it start to pick up again a little bit. As we kind of approach REM sleep, it kind of makes sense why we tend to see a little bit more brain activity, because I suppose REM sleep is probably what gets the most attention out of all our sleep. It's kind of where we tend to dream, when you tend to see kind of like a little bit more of the autonomic nervous system kind of start to pick up. You could tend to see like maybe you would be like just generally more aroused. You can see like sexual arousal, your heart rate goes up during this time. Your body temperature starts to increase as well. But in REM sleep, it's kind of defined by a really like chaotic brainwave activity, muscle tone, and we tend to see like bursts of rapid eye movements. So that's why it's called REM sleep. We tend to see a lot of occipital nerve activity around that stage as well. And that's common across like all mammals. So like if you took a horse, a dolphin, and a human, you tend to see quite similar responses to being in that REM stage of sleep. But during the initial cycle, like let's say the first sleep cycle, like that REM sleep might last only a minute, maybe 5 minutes, and it becomes eventually prolonged as the night goes on. So the amount of REM sleep you're exposed to increases with the amount of time you sleep. So I think that's really important for people to just kind of take note of. We know that your REM sleep is quite an important stage of the sleep process. For them to take away maybe that having maybe exposure to just, let's say they have 2 sleep cycles, let's say someone sleeps for only 3 or 4 hours a night, that if they were to actually sleep that 7 or 8, that 7th or 8 hour, they'd actually be exposed to more of the benefits from sleep than if they were to only sleep that 4 or 6 hours. Then I suppose we come to kind of like dreaming in REM sleep, which I think is kind of cool. It's most associated with REM sleep. That's why when you have your dreams, you just kind of wake up, you're in a panic, you realize J-Lo and Beyonce aren't in the bed beside you, and you kind of, reality comes crashing in and the jig is up. But yeah, it's dreaming is like typically associated with REM. We've a little loss of muscle tone and reflexes, likely have some important function because it prevents an individual like acting out your dream or nightmare while sleeping. So during that REM stage, you tend to see muscle tone. And what we mean by muscle tone is neural activity at a muscular level decrease. So like you have a shit ton of brainwave activity going on at this stage. It's you are basically awake, but you're just physically asleep. Mentally you're awake, but physically you're asleep. So brain shuts off a little bit of electrical signaling to your muscles to basically stop you climbing the fucking walls or going outside and playing into traffic at 6:30 in the morning.
Or murdering somebody,
Or murdering someone,
which has
or
happened.
yeah. But it's, I mean, it's a very, like, it's obviously a protective mechanism that we've
Yeah.
evolved over the years to stop us killing our spouses or whatever in our sleep. But about 80% of our vivid dreams comes about from arousal during that sleep stage. And it's REM sleep is for memory consolidation. So let's say we're kind of saying this earlier. Those sleep spindles really, really pronounced as well during REM sleep, and a really necessary part of remembering something and a part of the learning process. So if you're studying for an exam, doing an all-nighter, terrible idea. Studying not before you go to sleep, but studying and getting a good night's sleep, very, very necessary part of the process. So I don't know why my laptop sounds like a fucking airplane here, like it's going to take off. We'll chat a little bit maybe about physiology during sleep. So there's not a ton of changes that your body goes through, but we'll kind of break these down. So generally, like, the changes that you go through during sleep are very tolerable. Like, there are like some individuals with cardiovascular diseases that their condition can be compromised during sleep. It's not unheard of, but generally changes we see to the cardiovascular system, changes in blood pressure, heart rate, and these are under the control of the autonomic nervous system. So we see quite, I won't say large, but let's say like if your resting heart rate during the day, when you're not during the day, but when you're active, could be upwards of maybe, let's say, 65 to 70 beats per minute. You could see a heart rate go down to as low as 45 beats per minute during the night. Blood pressure typically decreases as well. But then we might see brief increases in blood pressure and heart rate depending on the amount of brainwave activity and how aroused you are during the night, and depending on bodily movements as well. So if you're at a period of the sleep stage where there's a lot of brain activity, you tend to see more movement. If there's less brain activity, you tend to see less movement. And that obviously will cause your heart rate to increase or decrease. In kind of people with heart conditions or cardiovascular disease, there is an increased risk of myocardial infarction in the morning due to rapid rises in heart rate and blood pressure that come with wakening. So just something to be aware of. So then kind of we come to maybe the nervous system. So we've the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous systems. With the sympathetic nervous system, we tend to see decreases as non-REM sleep deepens, but there is a burst of sympathetic nervous system activity during non-REM sleep, and that comes following brief, very like relatively small increases in blood pressure and heart rate. But compared to wakefulness, there is a rise in activity during REM sleep of that sympathetic nervous system activity. So then kind of the respiratory system, there is kind of a lot that happens kind of with our breathing during sleep. This typically just down to the decreases in heart rate. Won't get massively deep into it, but your ventilatory and respiratory flow change during sleep, and they become faster and kind of more erratic during REM sleep. So that's kind of a common theme we are seeing, that things really, really slow down during maybe stage 2 and stage 3 of our sleep. And as we approach REM sleep, we tend to see things pick up. There isn't really, I suppose, much need to get too deep into it, but you tend to see like maybe like night coughing as well as a not a symptom, but kind of picks up around at stage 3 and stage 4. So as we approach REM sleep again, that coughing tends to increase. The endocrine system, I suppose we kind of have to talk about, because growth hormone, testosterone, melatonin, they're all kind of influenced by sleep. Growth hormone secretion typically, or not typically, kind of most importantly. But growth hormone secretion does take place during sleep-wake cycles, while thyroid hormone secretion takes place in the late evening. Melatonin then as well, another hormone heavily influenced by sleep. This hormone does kind of induce sleepiness. It is something that people supplement a lot with, and for different reasons it's maybe not so great to supplement with chronically, unless you've maybe been prescribed it. The way kind of melatonin works is it reduces the alerting effect from that suprachiasmatic nucleus that we spoke about earlier in the brain. The suprachiasmatic nucleus is quite deep in the brain. It's located just above the medulla, and it's kind of above the brainstem. And this works with a feedback loop through your eyes, and it helps coordinate your circadian rhythm. And it's influenced by those light-dark cycles, and it's suppressed by the light. So supplementing with melatonin in some cases is a good idea, but generally it's something that if you hear Matthew Walker speaking about it, he kind of says that it's not the most. Have you heard him speak about it, Shane?
I have briefly, but I suppose it's one of those things that like even if you suffer with melatonin, if you're not really doing practices that will help to kind of improve its like use, it's probably not much use. Like, I mean, if you're staring at your phone or your laptop, or like watching TV, or have like a bright light shine in your face, hoping that's going to get you to get to sleep while taking a pill, it's not going to do a huge amount, because like light has such a big impact on like your own kind of natural secretion of melatonin.
So that's kind of a little bit on the physiology of sleep. So we kind of just covered sleep architecture. We know that sleep is kind of a momentary, I won't say loss of consciousness, but a break in alpha brainwave activity that kind of corresponds with low periods, low muscle tone, gives us a break from that sleep pressure and allows us to kind of carry on throughout our day. As the sleep pressure increases, then we need to sleep to clear it again. So it's a constant cycle that our body has to stay in for us to keep going. So Shane, from there, where do we?
Yeah, so I suppose the kind of next thing to touch on, like after we've kind of covered all that, is like, is there any kind of research on the area that would interest us the most? So, like, looking at like performance in sport or performance for strength athletes. So it does appear from like the bulk of the literature that, like, sleep is important, and sleep duration is like probably going to be the most bang for a buck thing that we can do to improve our performance. So from a recent systematic review is by Kirshen in 2020. So essentially this looked at 19 different studies examining 14 different sports to see, like, do longer sleep durations have a good impact on sleep, or good impact on performance, or negative, or neutral. And most of them found that, like, once, like, longer durations of like a week plus in terms of the studies found a net positive or neutral effect. With sports or disciplines that had a higher skill requirement to actually have a greater benefit, or a greater benefit from the longer duration of sleeps, and also a greater benefit from acutely long durations of sleeps. So something like a strength discipline. So one of the studies they looked at was in weightlifters, and they actually found with one night of acute sleep deprivation that their actual 1RM tests were not significantly different to when they were actually tested fresh, which is quite interesting. But you can kind of see this even if you are somebody who has trained, or who does train for powerlifting. If you have one night of bad sleep, typically your next day, your performance, if you're doing something that's low repetitions, it's probably not as bad as you think it's going to be, especially if you go in with the kind of preconceived idea that this session will go okay. Like, I think in these kind of cases, sometimes their psychological kind of mindset coming into these sessions can almost make them worse than they actually may be. So when we look at what actual measures of strength may be affected by poor night's sleep, it's going to be more likely to be things like work capacity, so our ability to actually produce volume. So one of the studies that was included in this systematic review was on rugby players, and they actually were doing like high volume bench pressing, rowing, squatting, and they found that their work capacity was diminished after a night of poor sleep, and after they had them like sleep for a bit longer in the next day, their sleep had actually, their performance had improved. And then the other one that looked at strength, so like there wasn't a huge amount of actual studies included in this review that looked at strength based outcomes. The other one was in karate. How do you say karateers? Karate athletes, I
Yeah.
suppose.
Okay.
Apologies to anybody who does karate.
Run with it. Doesn't
Yeah.
matter.
But essentially these are looking at isometric testing of like the biceps, which again we've kind of talked about, like isometric testing. It's not really representative of like your dynamic strength, which would be with like weightlifting. And again, like, if you're trying to do a bicep curl, isometrically, like, I mean,
Yeah.
it's kind of hard compared to like a clean and jerk, for example, with the weightlifting study.
Yeah.
So that's essentially what this review would say. However, one thing to kind of take into account is like the actual length of time that on average they spent in this study. For like, of all the studies, it was around 8.5 hours of sleep. So 8.5 hours is actually a good amount of time of sleep. However, you will hear that, like, oh, maybe athletes should spend a bit longer in bed, and maybe they're the type of studies that we need to see in the future, because there doesn't seem to be a huge amount of research examining like 9+ hours of total sleep time to improve performance.
Yeah. I suppose it would be massively dependent on training volume, and where the person is maybe in their competition schedule. I don't know if you find it, but like when things get a little bit heavier and you kind of approach maybe like you're getting into some heavy singles, the volume maybe was a little bit higher there earlier on, maybe first, maybe a week or two ago. Like my sleep does start to struggle, or not struggle, but does start to fade a little bit, kind of coming in. And once I kind of get the deload, it kind of does return back.
Hmm.
So kind of a little bit of neural fatigue does tend to affect your sleep. But as regards kind of um, recovery from training, like what I think would be interesting to see, like you said, if you did volume match across maybe 4 groups, and you had one group who slept maybe between 6 and 7 hours, one group that slept between 7 and 8 hours, one group that slept 8 to 9 hours, another group that slept 9+ hours, or maybe something like that. Maybe the hour gaps don't have to be so precise, but something like that, just to compare what is necessary, what is overkill.
Hmm.
Because I suppose spending 9+ hours in bed, 10 hours in bed for anybody during the days.
Yeah, and like even like with a lot of these studies, like there is like pretty big limitations to sleep studies in general, because a lot of them use like subjective scores, like just a sleep rating or performance. How recovered do you feel? How sore do you feel? Very few actually like use like quite expensive things like PSG. So that's called polysomnography. It's a difficult word to say, so I say PSG. And so very few use those, and at most they'll use like things like actigraphs or things like Fitbits, like Fitbit kind of devices, to try to measure sleep. And like there is a limitation with those as well. Like how sensitive could those actual sensors be on something like a Fitbit? Like how secure are they on the wrist? Is the person even wearing it for the entire time that they're doing it? If they're going home during the study, those kind of things. So there are also things that we have to take into consideration. So say, for example, there's another systematic review which looked at interventions to improve sleep. So this one, I suppose, it probably doesn't tell us much more than we already know. The kind of key takeaway being spending more time in bed is probably a good shout. And I think that one seems so obvious, but it's something that people don't really like take into consideration too much. It's usually, what can I take to improve my sleep? Is there a supplement I can use? Is there something that is going to help me track my sleep, that's going to help me upgrade it? And really, it's just actually just getting to bed a bit earlier, and having more sleep opportunity is probably going to be your best bet. It seems like sleep extension, and this like you have to think about, like, when you get into bed, if you say, for example, you say, right, I get 7 or 8 hours of sleep. Are you getting 7 or 8 hours, or are you in bed for 7 or 8 hours? Because they're different things. Depending on your kind of situation coming into sleep, like how quickly are you falling asleep once your head hits the pillow? You could be in bed, but you could be looking at your phone, and then, like, obviously that could be keeping you up, like directly from you continuing to look at your phone, or just the fact that we talked about the light stimulating your suprachiasmatic nucleus, keeping you from secreting that melatonin and keeping you awake. Okay, so there are other things that we have to look at. So outside of sleep extension, which is seem like to be the most powerful thing that we can do, we have other things, like, so sleep hygiene is one thing that is often talked about. So just kind of touch on sleep hygiene there a bit. Like, what are you doing in the hour or two before bed? Are you doing something that's stimulating yourself? So, for example, are you on your phone looking at Instagram, looking at things that are triggering you? Or like, even like coming up to sleep, when's your last meal? Are you eating a huge meal like 30 minutes before sleep? This can have like an kind of pretty heavy effect on you getting to sleep. One thing that does seem to regulate sleep is your body temperature. As we ingest big meals, our body temperature can increase, and this can increase the time it actually takes for us to fall asleep, because we're trying to do one very active process, being digestion, and one inactive process, sleep. So we're kind of doing both we're trying to do both very inefficiently. Um, do you have anything to weigh on there?
No, I think I don't know. You said a bunch of kind of interesting stuff there. I suppose one paper I was kind of chatting to you about just before we started was that paper from I think it's the Florida Athletic University (FAU), and it was a guy Michael Heischer came up with this paper. It was the impact of cognitive measures in sleep on acute squat performance in acute squat strength performance and perceptual responses in well-trained men and women. Um, and I thought this was a fairly cool paper because they had quite a large sample size. It was 58 people involved in the study. And they all had to be resistance trained for a year. So their inclusion criteria was that you had to be resistance training for at least a year, and you had to be back squatting for at least once a week for the past year. So these were all pretty experienced. All participants had to be able to squat 1.5 times their body weight, and women or men were required to squat 1.5 times their body weight, and women were required to squat at least their body weight to be included. Um, so they took them through 1RM testing. They gave them some readiness questionnaires. So when you're looking at research, particularly this kind of thing, you will see a lot of questionnaires being used. The questionnaires they used, two I've came across before. One was called the Daily Analysis of Life Demands for Athletes, and the second one was the Ovideo Sleep Questionnaire, fairly commonly used in this kind of thing when you're dealing with athletes. The third one I hadn't came across was the Competitive State Anxiety Inventory, and these were all used to assess kind of acute stress, anxiety levels, and sleep. So then they had a self-efficacy questionnaire. Again, self-efficacy kind of as a psychological construct, with 1RM testing, quite relevant. How do you feel about putting an extremely heavy weight in your back and standing up with it? Makes sense. So more or less what these guys did was they were given, they completed the scales to predict what loads they were 100%, 75 and 50% confident that they could lift for a 1RM. Then they completed their 1RM, which was tested with rate of perceived exertion. So that subjective scale we all know and love. And then they measured the average concentric velocity on each attempt. So they measured bar velocity. And that was kind of it really then. And they would have tested for what correlated with what and what was high when another was low. But really, they evaluated the impact of various psychological scales on 1RM back squat performance. And the major finding that they had is that the reported hours of sleep on the Ovideo sleep questionnaire was predictive of 1RM velocity and RPE. They found a significant relationship when analysing that for men, not in women. So that was more sleep was more predictive of that in men than in women. So individuals who reported more hours of sleep from the night before they did their 1RM testing tended to report higher RPs on the final 1RM attempt and performed their 1RM at lower velocities. So what that's kind of saying to us is that those with greater acute sleep, so again, we're only looking at this in a very snapshot, it's a pretty cross-sectional study, that those with greater acute sleep worked up to true 1RM than those with less sleep, as they were able to successfully complete an actual 1RM. So when we hear that, like, oh shit, they had higher RPs and their 1RM was a lower velocity, is like, that's a bad thing. It's not. It's a 1RM. It's, the bar is supposed to move quite slow. It's supposed to be quite difficult. So yeah, I think it's it's not it's not predictive. It's not saying that, like, if you sleep more, you're gonna have higher or 1RM or anything. But again, like, it's just something that we probably know. We know already, is that generally having a good night's sleep before you go do 1RM, just a good idea.
Yeah, and it would seem as well that, it kind of depends as well. If you do have a period that is a bit sleep restricted, depending on what side of the night is being restricted, that could be a bit more predictive of how your performance would be. So what I mean by that is, if you go bed a bit later and you're restricting the sleep by that way, that won't have as much of a negative effect as if you were woken up much earlier than you usually would.
Yeah.
And a reason for this could potentially be, as you go to bed a bit later, you will go to bed more tired. So you're probably going to sleep a bit quicker as your head hits the pillow. Your sleep efficiency will improve, and you're still going to get your time in all of those stages of non-rapid eye movement, non-rapid eye movement sleep, all your stages of deep sleep and REM sleep. Whereas if you are woken up much earlier than you usually would, you're probably going to be missing out on the kind of latter portions of that sleep cycle. Probably going to miss out on a bit of your REM sleep, which is important for your mood. So this could be a reason why, if you train very early in the morning, all of a sudden 1 week, as opposed to your kind of usual time and you wake up much earlier, your performance is not as good. And like these kind of morning sessions as well, if you do start to incorporate them into your kind of gym split, or if you're trying to transition from, like, usually training in the evening to maybe training in the morning, and you're altering your sleep cycles, that is why it does take a lot longer as well to get to adjust to.
Yeah, and I think, like, if you're a coach, um, and you know a person has, like, heavy, moderate, light sessions during the week or something like that, that there are, like, let's say you're coaching a nurse or you're coaching somebody that works shift work, setting up that person's training in a way, that, like, if they can report to you, oh, I have, like, Friday off, I can sleep, like, let's say they finish their shift on Thursday night at 9 p.m. They've just worked, like, I'd say 6 to 9 or something. They go to bed at 10 and they don't have to be awake early that Friday. Maybe it's a good idea to put their heavy stuff on the Friday, so that they can actually, they're recovered, they've enough sleep, adequate sleep going into that session. Like, it doesn't need to be complicated, as regards sleep, really. Like, it's just, like Shane was kind of saying earlier, just being diligent with your sleep hygiene, making sure that you're getting to bed at a stage where you're allowing yourself to get maybe that 7, 8, 9 hours of sleep, going to bed at the same time, but more importantly, getting up at the same time in the morning. Um,
Yeah, there does. There's definitely a huge like discipline element to it, and I suppose that's probably why so many people struggle with it, is because, like, you know, getting up at the same time and going to bed at the same time, it seems like something so simple, but it's actually quite difficult to implement. And like, I consider myself somebody who's decent at that, but I still have evenings where I maybe look at my phone a bit longer, or I forget to read, or something happens and I push back my bedtime. And it's just one of the kind of things that the more frequently you do it, the stricter with yourself you are, or even if you employ some kind of routine, uh, that will kind of make you want to go to sleep earlier. It does help. Like, say for example, something like reading, like taking that up. If you don't read, like even something like an audiobook, like, could be something that you only do in the last half hour or so before sleep, and that's gonna at least give you some kind of incentive to want to go to sleep a bit
100%,
earlier.
definitely agree with all that. I think it's just a good idea to just implement that, or at least aim for it.
Yeah, and then as well on the waking up at the same time, that is sometimes probably one of the harder ones too, because like we do have this concept called social jet lag, where people will sleep in quite late at the weekends, even though they will wake up maybe initially at their usual kind of wake up time. So if you're habituated to getting up at 7 a.m. at the weekend because you want the extra lie in, and you might wake up at 7 a.m., but then you're like, I'm going to stay in bed for another few hours, and you actually wake up feeling groggier.
Yeah.
And this has been thought to be because when we do wake up initially, it is due to a spike in cortisol. And cortisol essentially is what is going to get us out of bed, going to start mobilizing fuel to get us ready for the day. And if we stay in bed during this spike, we don't get it when we wake up in a 3 hours time, we can feel a bit kind of groggy getting up and out of bed.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
This morning.
in terms of other things that we can do though that like can potentially help, so one thing that came up a bit when I was looking into this was napping. And napping is something that, like, people will say they do to improve their sleep. It doesn't really seem that napping has a huge add-on benefit if you already get sufficient sleep. So if you get sufficient sleep already, like having naps throughout the day, it's probably not going to give you much of a benefit. But if you are getting, like, your 5-6 hours of sleep, it can be of benefit. I know, for example, like when I worked as a PT, and I would be sleep when you're working as a PT is just something that's quite difficult to actually really get a hang of, because you may have days where you're coming in quite late, and a lot of mornings where you're starting quite early, and you're for the most part you're sleep restricted, and you're expending a huge amount of energy throughout the day, so you're probably not recovering completely. So coming home and like even getting like a 20 to 45 minute nap can help, and it does seem like it can improve things like just sport performance as well as cognitive ability. One thing though to kind of bear in mind is, I suppose we touched on the sleep cycles earlier on, and if we are spending enough time for us to get into one of these sleep cycles, like waking yourself up during one of these can actually cause us to feel less rested.
Yeah.
So you will see recommended, if you're going to go for a nap, keep it either like 15-20 minutes, or try to get it to last a full sleep cycle. Now, one thing that is actually kind of done within the research is they don't actually measure to, or on the studies I looked at anyway, they haven't actually measured to see if the person is actually sleeping. So they would have looked at times between 25, 35, 45 minutes, and they would see that people feel quite rested after these times. But just one thing to consider is, are are the people actually sleeping? Some people reported that they weren't actually sleeping, but just the kind of practice of lying down and resting made them feel a bit more rejuvenated. And like anecdotally, I've definitely experienced that myself, not being able to get to sleep if I tried to nap, but just the act of, like, getting into bed, putting on an eye mask, and just kind of chilling out and trying to let your brain kind of relax for a short period of time can make you feel a bit more rejuvenated. Um, so that would be kind of what we would see when we look at napping. So, like, if you feel you get benefit from it, I mean, it's one of those things that there's no reason not to do it if you can afford to do it during the day. Um, it could be of benefit. One limitation to, like, one of the studies that I looked at was like they were looking at naps at kind of questionable times. So they're looking at people taking a nap at like 10:30 in the morning, um, with no kind of note as to like, oh, when this person woke up. Like, if I woke up at 7:30 and I went to go for a nap at 10:30, I'd have to question, like, well, was I tired enough to be taking that nap? How difficult would it be to get a nap in at that time? Whereas somewhere around midday may be a bit more beneficial. But then another thing you also have to take into consideration is, like, one thing they didn't actually look at was, like, how that affected the night of sleep later on that evening. Because it could potentially uh, take longer for you to fall asleep that night, uh, kind of taking away the point of actually taking a nap in the first place.
Yeah, I think napping is kind of a double-edged sword, but I think generally, like, if you're like you said, if your sleep time, like the amount of time you're sleeping and your sleep quality is not on point, I think generally just having a nap is probably a good idea.
Yeah.
Especially if you have a training session. Maybe you get to train at like, maybe you finish work at like 5 o'clock, you train at 6:30, like a very quick 15-20 minute nap, maybe in the car after work or whatever. As soon as you get home, probably a good idea.
Mhm. So in terms of other kind of sleep interventions we can look to use to improve our performance, recovery, all that kind of stuff. So we already talked about sleep extension, talked a bit about napping there, talked a bit about sleep hygiene. So, you know, trying not to be on your phone, doing anything too stimulating before bed, reading a book. Other things that you can look at doing are, like, you know, taking a warm shower. Essentially will look to regulate our body temperature a bit more to bring our core temperature down, which may make it a bit easier to fall asleep. Again, having big meals before bed, that's probably not a great idea. However, like, you also have to, with the big meals before bed, you also have to take into consideration what your general, like, day in general is like. Like, if you're somebody who has quite a busy job and you can't get in all, like, most of your calories in during the day due to kind of work limitations, maybe you have to have your bigger meals in the evening, and that's, or maybe you train hard in the evening, and that's one of the times that you can get a meal in. So, like, you know, there's other kind of things that you have to think about. So
Yeah, I think as well, one that most people will definitely agree with me on at the moment is just having a cool room, like
yeah.
being between 17 and 22 degrees Celsius. I think is the optimal, which is obviously really fucking hard to do at the moment.
Have
Um,
the window open or sleep
oh,
naked.
lads, it is fucking gruesome when you wake up and the cast of bugs life is fucking screaming at you half two. It's class. Get a fan, get a good fan. Um, have like I what I started doing is putting a pillow by the window so that when I wake up I have like a cold pillow. I can I can like when I take that one off I put like another one there for the next time I wake. I like have this conveyor belt system going on during the night. It's class. So yeah, that's pretty much it really, is it?
Yeah, I suppose there's just one other thing just I wanted to kind of mention. So you might see people, myself included, wearing
Okay,
these
is it?
these, might see us wearing these funny colored lenses. Yeah, from here. So we'll see people wearing these. So they are meant to be blue light restricting glasses. Do they actually work? It's hard to say. So
Yeah.
the two actual papers that I looked at, one of them reported a benefit and one of them didn't. One of them, like, I suppose both of them actually didn't use a control group to see actually if, like, people not wearing glasses at all improved their sleep. However, one of them, like, had a serious amount of limitations in the sense that they gave one group, like, you know, these glasses, and then the other group just had clear lenses. They didn't tell them that they were measuring sleep. They told them it was to do with, like, mood and alertness. But the questionnaire they gave them had about 10 questions on sleep. So, like, you know, the group that actually wore the glasses or wore the tinted glasses only reported an extra 7 minutes more of sleep. Again, they're all, like, kind of subjective measurements as well.
Yeah.
And, like, you know, if you have any kind of inkling that, you know, you're going to be using something and you've heard through the grapevine that this thing is going to maybe give you some sleep benefit, because pretty common knowledge these days to see people wear these glasses and know that they might have a benefit in sleep, that's enough to give you the kind of placebo effect that they might work. But even if something is placebo and it's kind of getting you in the mood and it's kind of reestablishing some kind of routine that you're going to implement before you go to sleep, that can be enough to start to unwind the process and get you ready for sleep. So, like, you know, it's an expensive placebo essentially. But,
Yeah.
you know, again, if it does give you that benefit, I mean, what's the harm?
Yeah. I think like you said, even just reading or having a routine before you go to bed is
Mhm.
a good idea. Just it's kind of like anything, like if you build associations in your head with things, be they like be it reading, be it like, I don't know, you put fucking lavender in your pillow or whatever, you put on your pajamas, so now you know I'm going to bed, or you turn off the television, or you turn on like a night light, whatever it is, like just try and repeat those. Like I suppose the number one thing is just making sure you're actually, lad, I'm actually yawning as I'm saying this, I'm actually bollocks. But making sure that like you're actually setting things up in a way just for you to be able to sleep, that like you're not sleeping until like 10-11 o'clock in the morning every day, that you're actually letting yourself go to bed at a reasonable hour. Like if you're seeing single digits on the clock every night when you're going to sleep, I mean, it's probably not conducive of a good night's sleep. And like that doesn't mean you're not going to make progress. This is the things that like you getting stronger or you building muscle isn't really isn't I won't say dependent, but again, like it is relatively independent to sleep. It's just not going to be optimal. I think that's kind of one important thing that we do have to say, that like while getting 8 or 9 hours of sleep is optimal, like optimal isn't an on or off switch. It's more like a spectrum of things being close to optimal or less than optimal. It's not that all your training and your life is going to shit and everything's going to fall apart for you. It's just not going to be as good as it could be.
Yeah, it's low hanging fruit, like.
Yeah.
Like considering how difficult it can be for people to master their nutrition, or like, you know, commit to a training plan.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, sleep is pretty handy. Like it doesn't come with as much kind of a like psychological kind of barriers.
Oh.
The only one is really like, you know, can you commit to being somewhere at the same time every day?
Yeah.
Bed shouldn't be too hard to be in. You get to lie down for like 8 hours. It's fucking so handy.
Really, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, so I suppose that pretty much covers everything. Like, we didn't touch on anything supplement based. I suppose we could do like a separate podcast itself on supplements in general for performance. Like, I mean, when it comes to sleep supplements, it's pretty lacking anyway. Like, I mean, you're not going to get anything as kind of powerful as the stuff we just talked about there. So, you know, it's probably not even worth touching on too much.
It's another can of worms, isn't it?
Yeah.
Cool.
So, yeah, thank you very much for listening. Hope you enjoyed this. As always, if you want to leave a podcast rating on iTunes, or give it a share, give the Spotify thing a share on Instagram, that'd be very much appreciated. You can find myself at Storey94 on Instagram. Lawrence, where can they find you?
I'm Jesus Christ, at _ Lawrence King on Instagram and Twitter, I think.
Nice one. Also, I suppose I'll just give my coaching a bit of a plug here as well. While I'm here, I do have a few spaces available for coaching at the moment. So if you are looking at upgrading your physique or getting into strength sports, definitely do give me a message. I'll be happy to help you out. So
Good.
That's pretty much it. Hope you have a great weekend, or whatever you do whenever you release this. And talk to you in the next one.